What lies behind the dark doors that humanity seeks to avoid? What if there is a hidden truth waiting to be discovered beyond our reach? Find out all this and more in The Silver Key, reimagined in English by the masterful H.P. Lovecraft, only on Classic Storytime Hub. Join us to uncover the secret of the Silver Key and the deep mysteries that lie behind it, mysteries that could change your life forever.
At 30, Randolph Carter lost something crucial, the key to his dreams. Before that moment, he had escaped the humdrum of reality each night, embarking on vivid journeys through cities that defied time and space, wandering through gardens so beautiful they seemed unreal, and sailing across seas that shimmered with the impossible. He was free to roam worlds untouched by logic, where the rules of nature bent and broke with every step. But as the years marched on, and middle age began to press in, something started to fade. Slowly at first, like the first cracks in a glass, but soon it was undeniable. The keys to these realms slipped from his fingers, one by one, until there was nothing left. No longer could he watch his ships drift past the towering golden spires of Thran, or hear the muffled steps of elephants wandering through lush jungles in Cled. Those forgotten palaces with their moonlit ivory columns were gone, silent and still in the distance, as though they had never been. He had immersed himself in the mundane, poring over books that told him how things are, not how they could be. He had spent too much time talking to people, too many well-meaning philosophers urging him to ground himself in reason, to analyze the processes of his own mind. And so the wonder, the magic, began to slip away. He had forgotten the one truth that had once sustained him. Life is just a collection of images in our minds. It doesn't matter whether they come from the world around us or from the dreams we dare to dream. In the end, they're all the same. But society had drilled into him that the tangible was all that mattered, that the material world was to be revered, leaving him ashamed of his own inner visions. The wise men, the scholars, the so-called rational thinkers, they had all called his dreams childish, inane, and so he believed them. But what he didn't see, what he had forgotten, was that even the so-called real world was just as absurd. People clung to their daily lives, believing them to have meaning, purpose, as though the endless grind of existence mattered in some grand way. But it didn't. The world had no purpose, no direction. It just was. And Carter, lost in his search for meaning, had forgotten how to live in the wonder of it all. The key was lost, somewhere in the shadows of his past, locked away in the dark corners of forgotten dreams. They had shackled him to the real world, chaining him to the mundane, the measurable, the known. And then they explained every last detail, every cause, every effect, until mystery itself vanished from the face of the earth. When he struggled, when he yearned to break free and escape into the twilight realms where magic wove the very fabric of his thoughts into endless landscapes of wonder, they didn't help him find it. Instead, they pushed him toward the wonders of science, urging him to find awe in the swirling vortex of atoms and the endless dimensions of the stars. But no matter how hard he searched, no matter how deeply he tried to understand the cold, unyielding laws of the universe, he found no spark of magic, no mystery. And when he admitted defeat, they told him it was his fault. He lacked imagination, they said. He was immature. How could he prefer the fleeting illusions of dreams over the so-called real world with its cold facts and measurements? So Carter tried to conform. He He forced himself to pretend that the trivialities of everyday life, the petty emotions, the tired struggles of human existence, were more valuable than the delicate fantasies that had once been his escape. He swallowed their logic and nodded along when they told him that the suffering of a weary farmer or the pain of a wounded animal were somehow more significant than the majestic beauty of Narath, a city of marble gates and chalcedony domes which he could still faintly recall from the haze of his dreams. He even allowed himself to feel pity and tragedy as they instructed him, carefully cultivating an appreciation for the sorrow and misery of the world. But every now and then, the truth pierced through. In the quiet, secret moments when no one was watching, Carter couldn't ignore the emptiness that lay beneath all human aspirations. He saw how shallow, how fragile, how utterly meaningless the world of men really was. Our greatest ideals, our loftiest goals, they were nothing but empty shells, polished over time, but hollow at their core. And so he would laugh, quietly, politely, like they had taught him to. A laugh aimed at the extravagance, the sheer artifice of his dreams. But in truth, it was always a laugh of self-recognition, for he saw clearly that the world they so desperately clung to was just as extravagant, just as artificial as the visions of his dreams, and far less worthy of respect. For all its pomp, all its supposed meaning, it was a world devoid of beauty, too stubborn to acknowledge its own lack of reason, its own lack of purpose. In the end, Carter became a humorist, but not the kind that made people laugh. No, his humor was the quiet, bitter kind that came from seeing the world as meaningless, a universe devoid of any true order, consistency, or reason. And yet, even humor itself became empty. In a world without purpose, what was there to laugh at? What was there to believe? In the early days of his struggle, Carter had turned to the familiar refuge of faith, the gentle, churchly beliefs handed down through generations. It was comforting, a promise of escape, the whispers of mystic avenues stretching into infinity, leading him away from the mundane chaos of life. But when he looked closer, something felt wrong. The beauty was gone. The faith that had once seemed so pure, so magical, had grown thin, starved of inspiration. What was left were stale rituals, dry doctrines, and a hollow seriousness that suffocated any remaining wonder. He could see it all now, the seriousness with which people tried to make reality out of myths that had long been shattered by science. The more they clung to these outdated beliefs, the more absurd they seemed. It troubled him to watch how desperately they held on to their sacred truths, trying to make literal facts out of stories that were never meant to be anything more than fantasy. The old myths had a certain charm when viewed as beautiful fables, rich with mystery, with emotion. But the moment they were weighed down with the absurdity of being literal facts, they lost their magic. Carter's heart grew cold to the old creeds, for they had forsaken their true nature, becoming instead the rigid and suffocating dogma of a world that refused to face its own absurdity. And then he turned to those who had abandoned the old myths. Surely they were free from the confines of superstition. But what he found in them was far worse. They had no understanding of beauty, of harmony. They had no idea that the loveliness of life isn't measured by some rigid standard in an aimless universe, but by its connection to the dreams and emotions of those who came before. They had no appreciation for how good, evil, beauty, and ugliness are merely perspectives, fruits of our own perception, shaped by the random winds of history, culture, and chance. And in their search for meaning, they had stripped away everything that made life worth living, leaving only cold, unfeeling logic. They had forgotten that beauty isn't about following rules, it's about the feeling it evokes. And that feeling, Carter knew, was the only thing worth holding on to. Instead of embracing the mystery and beauty of life, they either denied it outright or reduced it to the vague, primal instincts shared with beasts and peasants. Their lives became a grim chore, dragging on in pain, ugliness, and a sense of disproportion. Yet they wore a ludicrous pride in having escaped something that had once been no more flawed than the empty existence they now clung to. They had traded the false gods of fear and blind faith for the reckless idols of anarchy and license. But in doing so, they had merely exchanged one form of delusion for another. Carter, however, couldn't stomach this so-called modern freedom. The cheapness of it, the squalor, sickened him. His soul, which had once sought only beauty, could not find solace in a world so crude. His reason rebelled against the flimsy logic they tried to use, attempting to dress up brute impulse in a sacred veil taken from the idols they had discarded. He could see it clearly. Most of them, just like their discarded beliefs, couldn't escape the delusion that life had meaning beyond what humans dreamed into it. They couldn't let go of their narrow, outdated notions of ethics, of obligations beyond beauty itself, even when nature screamed its impersonal truth at them. Science had shown them that the universe had no inherent morality, no grand meaning, and yet they clung to their old ideals: justice, freedom, consistency, as though they could force reality to conform to their ideals. They rejected the old ways, the ancient myths, the old lore, but they never stopped to consider that it was that very lore that had shaped their thoughts and judgments in the first place. Without it, without those artificial standards to guide them, they were left adrift in a meaningless universe, a universe with no fixed aims, no stable points of reference. And in their newfound emptiness, their lives lost all sense of direction. The dramatic narrative of their existence faded. Desperate to fill the void, they turned to noise, bustle, and the pretense of usefulness, seeking excitement, barbaric displays, animalistic sensations. When those things grew tiresome, when their excitement turned to disgust, when disappointment set in, they cultivated irony, a bitter sarcasm, and began to pick apart the very social structures they had once embraced. They never realized the truth that the foundations they had built their lives upon were as shifting and contradictory as the gods of their ancestors. They couldn't see that the satisfaction of one moment would inevitably turn into the bane of the next. True, lasting beauty, the kind that fills the soul, can only exist in the dreams we cherish. But the world had discarded that solace long ago. In its blind worship of the real, it had cast aside the innocence and childhood secrets that once made life beautiful. Amidst the chaos of a hollow, restless world, Carter tried to live as any man of thought and heritage should. But his dreams, once so vivid, had faded under the mockery of the modern age. He couldn't bring himself to believe in anything. Yet the love of harmony still tethered him to the ways of his ancestors, his race, his station. He walked through the cities of men detached and impassive, sighing because nothing felt real anymore. Every flash of sunlight glinting off tall roofs, every glimpse of a balustraded plaza as the first lamps flickered on at dusk, only reminded him of the dreams he once knew, dreams of ethereal lands he couldn't remember how to find. It made him homesick. He had lost the ability to touch the worlds of wonder he had once roamed freely. Travel, once a grand adventure, had become nothing more than mockery, a futile attempt to find something that no longer existed. Even the Great War, a global upheaval, stirred little in him. He fought with the Foreign Legion of France, yes, but there was no fire in his soul for it. For a time he sought out friends, but they too left him disillusioned. Their emotions were crude, their visions earthbound. Nothing about their lives resonated with him. His family, those few who remained, were all distant. He was strangely glad of that, for none of them could understand the turmoil in his mind. None, that is, except for his grandfather and great-uncle Christopher, but they had long since passed from this world. So Carter turned back to writing, the one thing that had once brought him peace. Yet even here there was no fulfillment. The touch of earth had stained his mind.
The lovely things he once conjured with ease now slipped away from him. Ironic humor overshadowed the delicate minarets he built in his imagination, while the fear of the improbable stripped away the fragile flowers of his fairy gardens. Each time he tried to create something beautiful, the world's weight crushed it. Dreams were fading, and Carter was left in a cold, hollow reality.
The weight of assumed piety began to suffocate Carter's work. His characters, once rich with complexity, became drenched in the mawkishness of shallow virtue. And the myth of important reality, of significant human events and emotions, turned all his high-flying fantasy into nothing more than thinly veiled allegory, a cheap, hollow social satire. His new novels were successful, far more than his old ones ever had been, but Carter knew the truth. They were empty. To please an empty, mindless audience, he had sold out, traded beauty for convenience, meaning for the status quo. The realization stung him deeply, and in disgust he burned his works. He abandoned writing altogether. They had been graceful, yes, novels that had laughed at the dreams they once dared to sketch, but he saw now that their sophistication had drained them of all life. After that, Carter sought refuge in deliberate illusion, a search for something that could transcend the mundane, a way to combat the banality of the world. He flirted with the bizarre and the eccentric, hoping they would serve as an antidote to the commonplace. But even those quickly revealed their own poverty and barrenness. The doctrines of the occult, once mysterious and seductive, turned out to be as dry and rigid as the scientific ideas he had long rejected, without even a shred of truth to justify their existence. Gross stupidity, falsehood, and confused thinking were not dreams. They were just a distraction, a shallow escape for a mind trained to think above their level. So Carter dug deeper. He sought out the strangest books, the most terrible men, those with knowledge of the most arcane and forbidden realms of consciousness. He ventured into the darkest corners of life, legend and ancient lore, learning things that would disturb him forever. Secrets of life's pits and immemorial antiquity that haunted his every step. Determined to live on a rarer plane, Carter transformed his Boston home to reflect his inner turmoil. He created rooms for every mood, each one a sanctuary, designed with specific colors, carefully chosen books and objects, and equipped with sources of the senses, light, heat, sound, taste, and smell, curated to trigger the proper emotions. Each room was a reflection of his search for meaning, his desperate attempt to escape the limitations of the ordinary world. Once, Carter heard of a man from the South, shunned and feared for the blasphemous knowledge he had uncovered in prehistoric books and ancient clay tablets smuggled from distant lands like India and Arabia. Intrigued, Carter visited him, living with him for 7 years, sharing his studies in that isolated place. But one night, deep in the heart of an ancient graveyard, something terrible happened, something that shattered the line between the real and the unreal. By the time dawn broke, only one man emerged from the graveyard, forever marked by the horrors that had unfolded. Afterward, Carter returned to Arkham, the eerie, witch-haunted town of his ancestors in New England, where old memories clung to the dark corners of every street. There, amidst the hoary willows and tottering gambrel roofs, he faced other horrors that drove him to seal certain pages in the diary of an ancestor, a wild-minded relative whose dreams had been as wild as his own. But even those dark experiences, chilling as they were, could not take him back to the true dream country of his youth, the place where the impossible was possible and the soul could soar. By the age of 50, Carter had come to the bitter realization that there was no rest for him. The world had grown too busy, too clever, and too pragmatic for beauty to survive. Dreams once so vibrant, now seemed like distant memories, lost in the relentless march of time. Contentment was a stranger, and peace was a dream he could no longer hold. Having seen the hollowness of everything real, he retreated into solitude, spending his days lost in wistful memories of his dream-filled youth. He thought it almost silly that he even bothered to continue living, until a strange liquid from a South American acquaintance promised him the release of oblivion, without the pain. But something held him back, inertia, the weight of habit, and so he lingered, indecisive, surrounded by memories. Slowly, he began to refit his house, returning it to the way it had been in his childhood: purple panes, Victorian furniture, and all the trappings of a time long gone. As the years passed, Carter found himself unexpectedly glad he had stayed. His relics of youth, the distance between himself and the world, made everything feel distant and unreal, even life itself. It was as though the very sophistication of the modern world had faded away, leaving only the faintest whispers of magic. And with those whispers came a resurgence of hope, a touch of expectancy that stole back into his nightly dreams. For years, Carter's dreams had been nothing more than the twisted reflections of everyday life, mundane as the dreams of any common man. But now, something had shifted. A flicker of something stranger, something wilder returned. It was as though a vague, awesome presence had woven itself into his slumbers, shapes from his childhood days. Fragments of long-forgotten memories began to surface. Inconsequential things, insignificant details he hadn't thought of in decades came rushing back. At times, he awoke calling out for his mother and grandfather, both gone to their graves a quarter of a century ago. Then, one night, his grandfather came to him. The old scholar, as vivid as ever, appeared in his dream and spoke long and earnestly. He spoke of the ancient line they both came from, of the strange visions that haunted the delicate, sensitive men in their family. He told Carter stories of the flame-eyed crusader who had once learned the wild, secret knowledge of the Saracens, knowledge that held him captive forever. He spoke of the very first Sir Randolph Carter, who had delved into the mysteries of magic in the time of Queen Elizabeth. And he spoke of Edmund Carter, a relative who had narrowly escaped hanging during the Salem witch trials, a man who had placed something precious in an old antique box, a great silver key passed down through the generations. Before Carter awoke, his grandfather's voice guided him, telling him exactly where to find that box, the carved oak box, a relic so ancient that no hand had lifted its grotesque lid in 2 centuries. In the dust and shadows of the attic, he found it, hidden, forgotten, tucked away at the back of a drawer in an old, towering chest. The box was about a foot square, its Gothic carving so terrifying that it was no wonder no one had dared to open it since Edmund Carter's time. It made no sound when shaken, but it was steeped in the scent of unremembered spices, as if it held secrets that had long been buried. The legend of the key inside was vague, a story whispered down the generations. His father had never even known the box existed. Bound in rusty iron, the box seemed impervious to all attempts at opening it. There was no key, no mechanism for unlocking it, just an impenetrable lock. But Carter felt it, the pull, the instinctive knowledge that inside that box was something vital, a key to the lost gate of dreams. His grandfather had told him nothing about where to find the gate or how to use the key, but Carter knew. He knew it was there,
waiting for him.
An old servant, trembling with fear, forced open the carved lid of the ancient box. His hand shook as he gazed at the grotesque, leering faces etched into the blackened wood. A sense of eerie familiarity gnawed at him, but he couldn't place it. Inside, wrapped in a discolored parchment, lay a huge key of tarnished silver, its surface covered in cryptic arabesques, intricate symbols that seemed to pulse with their own dark meaning. But there was no explanation, no clear description of what this key was for. The parchment, voluminous and yellowed with age, contained only the strange hieroglyphic characters of a language Carter could not understand, written with an antique reed. Yet, as soon as Carter laid eyes on the symbols, he recognized them. They were the same characters he had once seen on a papyrus scroll belonging to the terrible scholar from the south, a man who had vanished one dark midnight in a nameless cemetery. The scholar had always shuddered when he read from that scroll, and now, as Carter looked at the symbols again, a cold shiver ran down his spine. But Carter was undeterred. He cleaned the key and kept it close, carefully storing it each night in its aromatic oak box, the very same ancient wood that seemed to carry the scent of lost ages. As time passed, his dreams grew more vivid, though they no longer brought him to those strange cities or incredible gardens of his youth. Instead, they took on a new, unmistakable purpose. They were pulling him back through the years, calling him towards something ancient, something buried deep in the bloodline of his ancestors. He knew, without a doubt, that he had to go into the past, to merge himself with the old, forgotten things that had shaped his lineage. Day by day, his thoughts turned to the hills to the north, to the haunted town of Arkham, to the rushing waters of the Miskatonic River, and to the lonely homestead where his people had once lived. As autumn's brooding fire cast its shadow over the land, Carter set out on the old remembered way, past the graceful curves of rolling hills and stone-walled meadows, through distant vales and hanging woodlands, along winding roads and nestling farmsteads, with the Miskatonic flowing like a silken thread beside him, crossed by rustic wooden bridges. At one turn of the road, he saw a group of giant elms, trees where an ancestor had strangely vanished a century and a half before. The wind stirred through the branches, and Carter shuddered, feeling the weight of history in the air. The trees whispered, as if to remind him of the ancient hidden forces that had shaped his family's past. As Carter continued his journey, he passed the crumbling farmhouse of old Goody Fowler, the witch. The house seemed to leer at him with its small, evil windows and a great roof that sloped down nearly to the ground on the north side, like some forgotten relic from another age. Carter's foot pressed harder on the accelerator as he passed it, unwilling to linger. He didn't slow down until he reached the hill where his mother and all her ancestors had been born. At the top of the hill stood the old white house, still standing, proud, looking across the road at the breathtaking panorama below. The land stretched out in a verdant valley, the rocky slopes tumbling down into a view of Kingsport's distant spires, and beyond that, the dream-laden sea, faintly visible on the horizon, whispering of ancient, forgotten things.
But there was little time to linger, for Carter was soon confronted with the steeper incline that led to the old Carter place, a house he hadn't seen in over 40 years. The afternoon sun was already low in the sky when he reached the foot of the hill, casting long shadows as he paused at the bend halfway up. The golden landscape spread out before him, bathed in the warm, magical light of a fading western sun. The fields seemed to glow, shimmering under the slanting rays, and everything around him felt otherworldly, as if the strangeness and expectancy of his recent dreams had seeped into the very land. He couldn't help but think of the lonely, silent solitudes of other planets as he traced his eyes over the velvet lawns, shining, undulant between the ruins of old stone walls. Beyond them, the clumps of fairy forest seemed to draw strange purple hills into the distance, and further still, the spectral valley seemed to fall away into deep, shadowed hollows. There, the dank waters whispered among twisted roots, crooning in their eternal, gurgling song. Carter suddenly felt a strange dissonance between the mechanical world of the motor car and the ancient realm he sought. His car, with its hum and engine, did not belong here, in this place untouched by time. So, with a quiet resolve, he left the car at the edge of the forest and tucked the great key into his coat pocket. He began to walk up the hill, the woods soon enveloping him completely. Though the house lay atop a high knoll, visible through the trees to the north, the woods felt all-consuming. He wondered how the house had changed. It had been left vacant, untouched since the death of his strange great-uncle Christopher 30 years ago. In his youth, Carter had spent countless hours there, playing and exploring the land. The weird marvels of the woods beyond the orchard had fascinated him then, strange secrets that seemed to pulse in the heart of the forest. Now, as he approached, those memories seemed distant, yet strangely vivid. As Carter walked deeper into the woods, the shadows thickened around him. The night was near. For a moment, a gap in the trees revealed a glimpse of the distant landscape. Across twilight meadows he saw the old congregational steeple on Central Hill in Kingsport, bathed in the last soft glow of the fading sun. The church seemed to glow pink, the light catching on the small round windows and igniting them with a fiery reflection. But as the shadows closed in again, something stirred in his mind. He startled at the thought. That glimpse, that familiar sight, could not have been real. The old white church had been gone for years, torn down to make way for the Congregational Hospital. He had read about it, intrigued by the strange burrows or passages that had been discovered beneath the rocky hill. Yet, for a moment, the illusion felt so real, his childhood memories tricking him, playing with time. Through his confusion, a voice cut through the silence, high-pitched and familiar. He froze, and his heart skipped a beat. The voice, though faint and distant, was unmistakable. It was old Benijah Corey, the hired man who had worked for Uncle Christopher. Back in his childhood, even then Benijah had been old, but now he must be well over 100, and yet that voice, piping and familiar, could belong to no one else. Though Carter could not make out the words, the tone was hauntingly clear. Benijah alive after all these years? "Mr. Randy! Mr. Randy! Where be ye? Do you want to skeer your Aunt Marthy plumb to death? Ain't she told you to keep nigh the place in the arternoon and get back afore dark? Randy! Randy!" He's the beatenest boy for running off in the woods I ever see, half the time a-sittin' moonin' round that snake den in the upper timber lot. "Hey, you! Randy!" Carter stopped in his tracks, the pitch-black darkness pressing in around him. He rubbed his eyes, feeling a strange sense of unease wash over him. Something was wrong. He realized with a jolt that he had been somewhere he shouldn't have been, had wandered too far into places that didn't belong to him. And now it was far too late. Too late to turn back. Too late to undo the path he had chosen.
Carter had not given much thought to the time when he saw the Kingsport steeple, though he could have easily made out the hour with his pocket telescope. But now, as the darkness pressed in, he sensed that something was very strange. His lateness felt unnatural, unlike anything he had ever experienced. He reached into his blouse pocket, wondering if his telescope was still with him, but no, it wasn't there. Instead, his fingers brushed against the heavy silver key, the very key he had found in that mysterious box. Uncle Chris had once told him an odd story about an old box, unopened, with a key inside. But Aunt Martha had quickly shut him down, insisting it was no story for a child whose mind was already filled with strange ideas and wild imaginings. Carter tried to recall exactly where he had found the key, but his memories were clouded, blurred by confusion. He thought it might have been in the attic back home in Boston. He vaguely remembered bribing Parks, the servant, with half of his week's allowance to help him open the box and keep quiet about it. But the moment he thought of Parks, the image of his old face flickered in his mind. The wrinkles of age seemed to have suddenly fallen upon him, as if years had passed in the blink of an eye. "Randy! Randy! Hi! Hi! Randy!" A swaying lantern appeared around the bend, casting long shadows as old Benijah appeared, practically pouncing on the silent, confused figure of Carter. "Durn you, boy, so there you be." Benijah's voice cracked with old age and frustration. "Ain't you got a tongue in your head that you can't answer a body? I've been calling this half hour, and you must have heard me long ago. Don't you know your Aunt Marthy's all a fidget over your being off after dark? Wait till I tell your Uncle Chris when he gets home. You ought to know these woods ain't no fittin' place to be traipsin' this hour. They's things abroad what don't do nobody no good, as my grandson knowed afore me. Come, Mr. Randy, or Hannah won't keep supper no longer." Randolph Carter was led up the road, where wandering stars flickered through the high, arching boughs of autumn trees. Dogs barked in the distance, while the soft yellow glow from small-paned windows shimmered at the next bend in the road. The Pleiades sparkled above, their lights casting an otherworldly glow over the open knoll, where a great gambrel roof stood dark against the dim western sky. Aunt Martha stood in the doorway when they arrived, but she didn't scold too harshly as Benijah shoved Carter inside. She had known Uncle Chris long enough to expect such things from the Carter blood. Randolph didn't show her the key. He simply ate his supper in silence, his mind preoccupied, only protesting when bedtime came. There were dreams that came more vividly when he was awake, and he knew the key was part of it. The next morning, Randolph was up at the crack of dawn. He would have run off to the upper timber lot, a place that called to him, if Uncle Chris hadn't caught him and forced him into his seat at the breakfast table. As he glanced around the room, the low-pitched ceiling seemed to press in on him, the rag carpet on the floor and the exposed beams overhead, a reminder of the mundane. But he smiled faintly when his eyes caught the orchard boughs scratching lightly at the lead-paned window. Beyond, the trees and the hills seemed to be gates to a world he knew was his true home, the world he longed for, the world beyond. When he was finally free, he slipped his hand into his blouse pocket and felt the reassuring weight of the key. With that, he skipped off across the orchard toward the rise beyond, where the wooded hill climbed up to heights that seemed to touch the sky. The forest was mossy and full of mystery, the lichen-covered rocks rising like ancient monoliths scattered throughout the grove. The trees towered above him, their twisted trunks forming the sacred pillars of a forgotten world. As he climbed higher, Randolph crossed a rushing stream, its falls whispering runic incantations to the lurking fauns, the agapans, and the dryads who might still roam in the shadows.
Randolph Carter soon reached the strange cave in the forest slope, the dreaded snake den that the local folk avoided and which Benijah had warned him about time and time again. It was a dark, deep place, far deeper than anyone else knew. But Randolph, ever the curious soul, had discovered a fissure in the farthest, blackest corner of the cave, a crack that led to a loftier, more mysterious grotto beyond, a place that sent a shiver down his spine. It was an eerie, sepulchral chamber where the granite walls seemed to pulse with a strange, almost unnatural symmetry, as if they were crafted by hands that knew too much. This time, as was his habit, Randolph crawled in, lighting his way with the matches he had quietly taken from the sitting-room match safe, his movements full of a strange eagerness he couldn't quite explain, even to himself. He couldn't pinpoint why he approached the far wall with such confidence, nor why he instinctively pulled the great silver key from his pocket as he did so. But on he pressed, drawn to some unknown purpose, as though the key and the wall were meant for each other. That night, when he finally returned to the house, he offered no excuses for his lateness. He didn't care about the reprimands he received for ignoring the dinner horn, a small detail that seemed insignificant compared to the strange events he had just witnessed. It was in the autumn of 1883 that something changed within Randolph Carter, something that marked the beginning of a very different journey. According to all his distant relatives, something occurred when he turned 10 that heightened his imagination to an unsettling degree. His cousin, Ernest B. Aspinwall, Esquire, of Chicago, who was 10 years older, clearly remembered a shift in Randolph after that autumn. He had begun to see visions, fantastical scenes that few could even dream of. But what was even stranger were the odd qualities that Randolph began to exhibit in relation to everyday life. Over time, Randolph seemed to acquire a strange, almost prophetic ability, reacting to mundane things with a depth and understanding that made no sense at the time. It was as if he had glimpsed the future in some unexplainable way. And sure enough, as the years went by and new inventions, names, and events began to shape the course of history, people would occasionally recall with wonder how, years before, Randolph had dropped some offhand remark that now seemed to connect with things far in the future, things that had yet to even exist. Randolph Carter never fully understood the strange words that seemed to slip from his lips at times, nor why certain places or sounds stirred deep, inexplicable emotions within him. It was as if some unremembered dream had woven them into his very being, like threads of a tapestry he could never fully recall. But there was one moment back in 1897 when he turned pale as a traveler casually mentioned the French town of Belloy and Santerre. His friends couldn't understand why it had such an effect on him. But years later, in 1916, when Carter was almost mortally wounded there while serving in the Foreign Legion during the Great War, they remembered that moment, how that strange, haunting connection had been there long before. But it was not just his inexplicable reactions that had left his relatives talking. Carter had disappeared. His loyal servant, Parks, who had tolerated Randolph's bizarre quirks for years, was the last to see him. It was on a quiet morning when Randolph drove off alone in his car with that mysterious key he had recently found. Parks had been with him when they opened the old box with its grotesque, unnerving carvings. There was something about the box that seemed to affect both of them, something they couldn't quite name, a sensation both unsettling and familiar. Carter had told Parks he was going to visit his old ancestral lands near Arkham, but he never returned. Not long after, his car was found parked carefully by the roadside halfway up Elm Mountain, on the way to the ruins of the old Carter place. Inside the car, there was a wooden box, carved with the same eerie, almost alien designs that had haunted them when they first opened it. The box held only a strange parchment covered in cryptic symbols that no linguist or paleographer could identify or decipher, as though they were from a language lost to time. The rain had long since washed away any footprints that might have offered clues, but the investigators from Boston discovered something disturbing. In the ruins of the old Carter place, there were signs, disturbances in the fallen timbers, as if someone had been groping around in the dark, searching for something.
They couldn't say what, but it was clear that someone had been there very recently. A white handkerchief found among the rocks on the hillside beyond offered no further answers. It wasn't his. It didn't belong to the missing man. And so, the mystery of Randolph Carter's disappearance deepens, leaving only a trail of unanswered questions, strange symbols, and a key that no one knows how to use.
There is talk among the family about dividing up Randolph Carter's estate, but I will not stand for it. I refuse to believe that he is dead. There are twists of time and space, of vision and reality that only someone like Carter, someone who truly understood the language of dreams, could ever hope to navigate. From everything I know of him, I am certain that he has discovered a way to transcend the very boundaries of existence. Will he ever return? I can't say. But what I do know is this: he sought the lands of dreams he had once lost, and he longed for the innocence of childhood he could never reclaim. And then he found a key. Somehow, I believe that key became the means by which he unlocked something far greater than anyone could comprehend. I will ask him, of course, when I see him again, and I expect that meeting to happen soon, very soon, in a city from our shared past. There are whispers in Ulfar, beyond the river Sky, that a new king now sits on the opal throne of Vod, the legendary city of turrets perched high upon hollow cliffs of glass, looking out over the twilight sea. In those waters, the bearded finny Gnori are said to build their labyrinths, complex, unknowable paths that twist and turn in impossible directions. I believe I understand the meaning of this rumor, and I am eager to see for myself. Above all, I look forward to seeing the great silver key once more, for in its cryptic arabesques may lie the key to understanding all the aims and mysteries of a universe that moves blindly forward, unchanged, impersonal, and yet somehow full of meaning for those who dare to dream.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.